Having encountered some interface problems, it might be worthwhile to consider possible solutions to them. There are actually two reasons for this. So one is that I think that interface problems are paradigmatic philosophical issues that arise when we consider the behavioural sciences. And secondly, because I think some of the solutions might tell us something interesting about things that we care about as philosophers independently, namely about the nature of experience. So if you've been following along so far, you will have encountered two interface problems already. One concerns action selection. It's a distinction between primary motivational states and preferences. The other concerns action execution. It's an interface problem concerning relations between motor representations and intention. Now, I want to suggest when you do psychology, what you'll see is that interface problems are absolutely pervasive. So we'll find them when we think about perception, we'll find them when we think about action, we'll find them when we think about emotion, when we think about almost any aspect of human life, we'll come up against interface problems. But these are the two that are particularly relevant for us on this course. Now, the first interface problem, fortunately for us, there is already proposed in the literature something of a solution to it. So what I propose to do is to introduce you to the solution as proposed in order that you might provide some critical discussion of it. The solution is one on which your experience is absolutely critical. It's your experience that allows you to have a kind of somewhat unified motivational life, despite the fact that you've got two systems which are, for the most part, operating independently. This is an idea of Dickinson and Belane's. They think that primary motivational states, such as hunger, don't directly determine the value of an instrumental goal. Instead, I already mentioned this, but it's giving you the key. Animals have to learn about the value of the goal commodity in a particular motivational state through direct experience with it in that state. So their idea here, I think, is relatively simple. You do not know that you're averse to a novel food, the sugar solution if you're the rat, the papaya if you're the subject, or the human subject in the experiment. You do not know that you're averse to that food. So there's no way that your aversion influences your preferences. You still go ahead and happily order the papaya. You hope that it will arrive with you and that you're looking forward to eating it. You have a strong preference for eating that over this kind of, slightly soggy toast. But when the papaya comes, you have the possibility to experience your own reaction to it, your aversion to it. And now your preferences change because you dislike it, because it manifestly causes the aversion in you. So it's experience here that's playing the key role. So let's look at it like this. You're averse to something, but that aversion hasn't yet altered your preferences. So devaluation, strictly speaking, has not yet taken place. How do we get from aversion to devaluation? First of all, the aversion has to cause a bodily response in you, some kind of physiological reaction, disgust reaction. Secondly, you have to experience that disgust reaction. You have to be aware of what's happening in your body. And that experience will then alter your preferences. That's how we get to devaluation. It's simple, but it's also profound because it tells us something about why we have experiences at all. Why is it that rats or humans should be aware of bodily states such as hunger or revulsion? There's lots of things that happen in our minds and our bodies that are completely opaque to us, that we learn about, if at all, only through a form of scientific investigation. So why is it that something like the effects of things on us when we encounter aversion, disgust, and the rest, why should we have awareness in those cases? And the answer is because that awareness is what enables our preferences to be coupled, but only quite loosely coupled, to our primary motivational states. This is a beautiful thing. The experience is a beautiful thing because it gives us a certain amount of freedom from the primary motivational states, but it prevents the two things from being forever pushing off in different directions. You might say, look, Steve, there's a problem here. There's a problem that you encounter whenever you have any kind of dual process or two systems theory. You always get the objection, well, look, it would just be redundant to have both kinds of state. Why should we have primary motivational states on the one hand and preferences on the other? What's good about having those two kind of things? Well, here's Dickinson and Ballane again. The motivational control over instrumental actions is at least in part indirect and mediated about your learning about your own reactions to primary incentives. By this process, they say, our instrumental actions are liberated from the tyranny of primary motivation. Right? Liberated from the tyranny of primary motivation. Now, this is a marvelous thing because it allows you to be a reasonable human being. It allows you, for example, to eat something which you know is a life-saving medicine, even though eating it is extremely unpleasant for you, extremely disgusting, and to undergo all kinds of therapy and so on, which you, in many cases, know. In the good cases, you know that the therapy is likely to have a positive effect on you, even though, of course, it is something that very much runs against your primary motivational states. And so on when we think about hunger and lust and the rest. The advantage of having two kinds of motivational states, the primitive motivational states and the preferences, is that it allows us maximum flexibility here. We can, as a consequence of learning and cultural factors and all other kinds of things, develop and change and adapt to our environments in a super flexible way, although those primary motivational states will provide a kind of basic form of survival for us, keeping us away from things that, for example, are poisonous but delicious for the most part. Not always, but for the most part, they will help us to do that. They will be useful guides to us. The fact that these two things are connected only loosely via experience means that we always have the option. From the point of view of preferences, the experiences that are consequences of our primary motivational states are just one factor among many in ranking our preferences. If you really wanted to, you could go ahead and force feed yourself that papaya if something really hung on it. If somebody said to you, I'm going to murder your cat unless you eat the papaya, you of course could do that. You would do that. The primary motivational states are resulting in experiences which are just one among many factors that inform your preferences. This is a beautiful connection. So it's not redundant to have multiple motivational states because it allows humans to gain an optimal balance between what we might think of as a fast but very robust system and a more flexible adaptive system that in cases can go horribly wrong and needs to be backed up by that more basic system. Where are we then? We've seen that there are two or more kinds of motivational state that dissociate in the sense they can pull you in conflicting directions. That gives us an interface problem, and if Ballane and Dickinson are right, the interface problem is solved by experience of our own bodily reactions. So here we've got two things for the price of one. We've got on the one hand an interesting way of solving an interface problem, and on the other hand an interesting answer to the question, why should there be experience of bodily reactions? Why should humans or rats have such a thing? And that can help us to understand what experience must be. Now we've got a constraint on what experience could be. So that's a useful thing if we're interested just in experience. But then you might think, well, look, can experience also play a role in solving other interface problems? One interface problem might be quite different from another, so they might have entirely different solutions. Or maybe there's a common theme. So maybe whenever an interface problem arises, we have experience, and maybe the fundamental fact about experience is that it's there to provide some limited kind of unity to a mind that is made up of multiple largely independent systems. Maybe that's what fundamentally experience is for, why you and I have it. So I don't know what the answer to that question is, but I do know that we could have a look at the second interface problem here. So the second interface problem we had concerned the execution of action and the gap between motor representation and intention. You remember that because of their different representational formats, there's again here a lack of inferential integration, giving rise to the question, how is it that these two things ever non-accidentally match? The interface problem. Is there a role for experience here? Could there be? Well, let me start by talking about two complications. The complications show that what we're dealing with here is something different from and probably more difficult than we were seeing when we were thinking about motivational states. And the first complication comes from the work of Ellen Fridland, a philosopher, and she points out that if we want to solve an interface problem, we shouldn't think just that motor representations are triggered by intentions. Instead, we have to think that motor representations sometimes non-accidentally continue to match intentions as circumstances change in unforeseen ways throughout skilled action execution. And here she's objecting to an earlier attempt to solve the interface problem that I haven't shared with you by Butterfield and Sinigalia in their work on this. So here's Fridland's point. Now let me illustrate this. So you might think what you're doing here is you form an intention to drink some tea, and you go and kind of reach over and you go and grab the mug. But on the way there, what you realise as the action unfolds is that this whole thing is just tremendously awkward because the mug is in completely the wrong position, and there's a danger of knocking the coffee over and destroying some valuable electronics. So what you do instead of continuing to reach is you stop and you stand up and you move over. Now what's happening here is really interesting. So there is an intention, and the intention is causing a certain kind of motor representation, grasp the mug and so on. The experience of acting now, though, is feeding back and causing you to revise that intention so that you won't just grab the coffee from where you are. Instead, you form the intention to stand up, move over and take the coffee. Or alternatively, you might abandon the intention to drink the coffee because you're just too busy clacking away at your keyboard and you've got no time to stand up if that's what it takes to get to the coffee. So what is Fridland telling us here? She's a philosopher. So she's telling us this, that in the previous case, we were thinking about aversion as guiding preferences, and we could think of what happens is this, that you get the aversion and then experience can modify the preferences, but it's like the aversion just hands over to the preference, has its influence, and then it's done, right? Whereas what Fridland is telling us in the case of action execution, things are much more complicated. It's not just that we want the intention to be a constraint on which motor representations occur in you, which outcomes are represented motorically. It's also that we want the way the motor representation unfolds to have some kind of influence on the intention itself as the action goes on, so that as the action unfolds, you might discover this is not an appropriate action for me to perform after all. So what you can see here is that the interface problem is going to be a bit more complicated in this case because we need this ongoing connection between the two and bidirectional connection between the two. We cannot think, as Fridland says, of motor representation simply as being triggered by intentions. That won't get us the richness. Here's a second complication. Second complication is that intentions can concern minute details of ongoing actions. And the illustration for this comes from some tapping studies. So there are lots of studies in psychology which just ask people to tap and to maintain a rhythm while they're tapping. An expert pianist can do this incredibly accurately. So expert pianists can do this to within, I think, 5 milliseconds. So that's far smaller. The gap between the required timing and the expert pianist's actual timing is far smaller than anybody could detect audibly. So you can do this very precisely. But what we also know is that even in that tapping action, there's significant motor variability. So no person can tap twice in the same way. Motor action is subject to significant variability. There's, if you like, error in the process of motor control, always. So how is it that people manage to tap and to maintain tapping in a target rhythm? How do they do that? We notice that there are two kinds of corrections that they make. They can shift the phase of their tapping in order to better match the target, or they can shift the period. So they're slightly speeding up or slightly slowing down to change the period, and here what they're doing is delaying or advancing one tap but keeping the period the same in order to shift. Now the other thing that we know here is that the phase shift is something that you have very little intentional control over at all for the most part. So there's very little evidence that anybody can actually do control here. Whereas the period shift does appear to be subject to intentional control. Now that's interesting for us because what it shows us is that in the context of some fairly large-scale action, so you might be performing a piano piece, or you might be doing something quite rhythmically with another person, like passing a glass and so on. As well as your intentions controlling large parts of the action, you might have an intention concerning a tiny detail of the action. Just shift that period on a bit. And that would be your intention reaching all the way down to the case. So what we have to think about in general here is this idea. It's not that the intention sets the overall goal of the action, the one which is furthest up the mean end hierarchy of goals, and then the motor processes take over and do all of the planning. It's that we can get intention targeting at lots of different levels in the means end hierarchy, so that not just with respect to time, that was Fridland's point, but also with respect to where we are in the means end hierarchy, we might have intentions targeting multiple levels, motor representations linking in between. Elisabeth Pachery suggested something very interesting. So I know nothing about piano, but she says if you're really good at playing the piano, you can play a fugue with 3 voices, and it's possible to keep those voices apart, but that doing that requires not just forming intentions about large scale things that you might be doing in the piano piece. Apparently you do need, if you become such an expert pianist, you mainly need to pay attention to fairly large things that are happening and let the fingers do the work themselves. But Pachery says, in playing the 3-voice fugue, you also have to very often pay attention to particular timings of finger movements there. So that would be another example of this. The intention has to be able to reach in and make a difference to some tiny part of the action, even though above that in the means end hierarchy, the motor representations are doing the stuff. So the idea that we can solve the interface problem in the case of intention and motor representation is looking extremely difficult. It's looking much more complicated than it was in the case of motivational states, primary motivational states and preferences. Well, I wonder whether or not I should make a suggestion here. So the truth is that although several philosophers have recently been writing about this particular interface problem, I think it's fair to say that nobody has yet gone far in solving it. And I hesitate to share with you in these lectures ideas that are both substantial and not already published in a peer-reviewed journal at the very least, right? And ideally supported by evidence. On the other hand, so what I'd encourage you to do is just skip over this, just zoom ahead about 5 minutes to the end of the recording, and I'll offer you what I hope will be a somewhat satisfying conclusion. On the other hand, I know that at this point in the course, there is only one person who's here at all, right? So I can't do too much damage if I do include this. It won't do too much harm. Sorry, you're only here because you thought it was about Hegel, and you were feeling too polite to leave. Okay, never mind. So Hegel is a bit of a stretch. I could probably do something that would link this to Husserl, the phenomenologist, but I'm not sure I can connect up to Hegel. I'm sorry about that. All right. So very quickly, an object index is a mental pointer to an object which is bound up with perceptual processes. So object indexes are features of broadly perceptual processes which enable you perceptually to keep track of objects, their movements, and perhaps also of their interactions. There's a lot of literature about object indexes, but the work I'm citing here by Brian Scholl will provide you with a reasonable introduction. I'm not suggesting for the purpose of this course that you learn about object indexes, although they are one of my favourite things in psychology. And it's almost like you could spend your life researching these things, and indeed several people do. Now, one of the interesting things about object indexes is that they are quite independent of beliefs. So for example, if this thing here moves behind the screen in front of it, and consistent with the trajectory of a single object, you now see the solid cylinder coming out again, the same object index will be assigned to this object. You would just have a single object index for a moving object, even though of course you know perfectly well if you see something like this that the pattern square must be behind the screen and the solid ring must be a completely different object. So you've got one belief, there are two objects, and something that's implied by your system of object indexes, there's only one object, and those two things are incompatible. So object indexes are interesting because they provide perceptual processes with a way of keeping track of objects' movements and their interactions, and they do so in a way that's independent of beliefs. So also in the case of object indexes and beliefs about objects' locations, we're going to find that there will be an interface problem. But look, that's really another story. What I want to suggest here is just something much simpler. There's a question, what is it that object indexes contribute to experience? And it's tempting to think that they could contribute nothing, because after all, if we think about vision, right? So vision is just a matter of the arrangement of the surfaces in space. So here you've got a moving surface and here you've got a moving surface. They're arranged in space in a certain way. Once you've got that, you've fully specified the visual experience, or so it would seem. So it doesn't seem like there's any room for object indexes to contribute something further, right? So it's not like colour, right, versus shape. So colour and shape are clearly two dimensions of or two aspects of your visual experience here. It's not like object indexes is somehow this further dimension, the objectness of something. That's just not how it works. It's not how it works at all. So it's tempting to think that they could contribute nothing at all to experience, but that would be a mistake, because object indexes contribute structure. Object indexes contribute structure to your experience. The overall phenomenal character of your experience, not necessarily the visual specific parts, but certainly the perceptual experience, involves a structure of objects in motion, and that structure is provided by the object indexes. So object indexes are independent of beliefs in the sense that they can imply that there are fewer or more objects than you truly believe there to be. Object indexes provide structure to your experiences, and they're subject to limited but very indirect cognitive control through attention. So depending on what you attend to, object indexes will get assigned differently or not assigned at all. And I want to say, look, maybe we can draw a parallel here with motor representations. Now, this is a slightly mad idea. I've already told you that you should have fast forwarded to the end, so if you're still here... Oh, that's nice. Okay, good. You were here for the Hegel, but it's worth staying for. If you're still here, look, this is just super speculative. Super speculative. I'm really offering this as a provocation. Let's try and kind of think about how we might solve it. It is the last lecture, so we're all good. So the motor representations are somewhat like object indexes in these three respects. They're somewhat like object indexes in these three respects. So it's a very tempting thought that the motor representations might provide some contribution to your experiences by structuring them. And if that was right, then we could see how it is that the way that the motor representations unfold might influence and cause changes in your intentions, and also, conversely, how it is that you might, through intention, manage to lock onto or make more probable that certain outcomes will be represented motorically than others. You might be able to do that because the motor representations make their mark on your experiences, so that even though the motor representations are unknown to you, you do have a sense of what the indexes are. So this is a very speculative idea. I think that it may be that motor representations of outcomes structure experiences, imaginings, and prospective memories in ways that provide opportunities for attention to action directed to those particular outcomes, so that forming intentions concerning an outcome can influence your attention to the action because of the way that the motor representation structures it. And that can influence whether or not the motor representation of that outcome persists or not. This is the action index conjecture. The idea is that because motor representations provide a structure to experience, it's possible that you can, via attention, lock onto particular motor representations in intention. Although, of course, all your intentions will ever do is make it more or less probable that certain outcomes are represented motorically. Now, I said this is a highly speculative view. It's not something that I expect anybody to accept, and indeed, whenever I've presented this at workshops, it's met with very robust opposition. So it's important to see what kind of predictions would you get. So it's absolutely fine to propose a crazy idea as long as it makes readily testable predictions and therefore is likely to be refuted rather quickly. So here are two predictions. The first prediction is that we should find that not all action-related changes in experience are merely changes in bodily configurations, movements, and their sensory effects. So if we were able to make differences to the goals, perhaps using something like the McGurk effect or another phenomenon, while keeping the bodily configurations, movements, and sensory effects constant, and conversely, what we should find is that there is some change in experience that we can generate, which is not explained by changes in bodily configurations, movements, or sensory effects, but rather by changes in goals, and conversely. Right? And ideally, changes in goals that could be represented motorically. So if that prediction was confirmed, we would be not willing to accept the action index conjecture, but getting closer. Another prediction is that memory for objects ought to be influenced by their affordances because the motor representations, structuring of experiences should correspond to the affordances. So what we've seen is that there are two interface problems and that it's possible, although extremely difficult to know for sure, that experience may also be crucial to solving the second interface problem about motor representations coming apart from intentions. Why is this so exciting? What we've seen is that a single action can involve multiple dissociable, motivational, and effective states. That's an important difference from nearly every philosophical theory, which assumes that there's a kind of unity in the states which are involved in action, and that unity is provided by inferential and normative integration. Once we take seriously the discoveries about the control of action and the way that preferences work, we see that that kind of view is no longer sustainable. We need an entirely different approach to constructing philosophical theories about the nature of action, models about how action works. It's also important that we don't understand how these different dissociable, motivational and affective states ever non-accidentally match. That's a really big gap in our understanding of the story of action. There is a hint, but just a hint, that experience of our bodies, in the case of the motivational, and of action possibilities, in the case of the affective representations, the motor representations and intentions, may play a role here. But until we make progress with these things, we cannot claim to have understood very much about the nature of action at all.